You're filling out a survey app for a friend's birthday party. Which one of us is most likely to? And you tap your own name for 3 questions in a row without thinking twice. You already know exactly who you are. You've known since you were a teenager. Type A, introvert, the funny one, whatever label stuck first and never got questioned again. It feels less like an opinion and more like a fact you're reading off a name tag you've worn your whole life. Except the version of you that's answering that survey, and the version everyone else sees might not be the same person at all. This video is about why you're one of the worst possible judges of your own personality. By the end, you'll understand why the people who know you best sometimes know you better than you know yourself, and why that's not actually a flaw. It's how self-knowledge was designed to work from the beginning. Start with a psychologist named Bertram Fauré. Back in 1948, he gave his students a personality test, then handed each of them a personalized result and asked them to rate its accuracy on a scale of 0 to 5. Most rated it somewhere between 4 and 5. The twist: every single student got the exact same paragraph, lifted almost word for word out of a newspaper horoscope column, vague enough to fit nearly anyone. You have a tendency to be critical of yourself. At times, you have serious doubts about whether you've made the right decision. You pride yourself on being an independent thinker. Nobody shrugged it off as generic. People felt personally seen by it, several describing it afterward as one of the more accurate personality readings they'd ever taken, despite the fact that it was structurally a horoscope. That effect now has a name, the Forer effect, sometimes called the Barnum effect, and it's the first real crack in the assumption that you have direct, reliable access to your own personality. If a stranger can hand you a paragraph written for everyone, and you'll swear it was written for you specifically, then your internal sense of, yes, this describes me, is a lot shakier than it feels in the moment it fires. But here's where it gets interesting. Move to something more structural. How psychologists actually try to measure personality at scale, outside of a one-off classroom trick. The dominant framework in academic psychology is called the Big Five, refined through decades of factor analysis work, most notably by researchers Paul Costa and Robert McCrae throughout the 1980s. 5 broad traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. When people fill out Big Five questionnaires describing themselves, and then close friends or family fill out the identical questionnaire describing that same person, the 2 sets of scores line up reasonably well on traits that are loud and externally visible. Extroversion especially, since it's hard to hide a room full of people you just worked. But they diverge hard on traits that live mostly on the inside, like neuroticism or openness. You can watch someone be anxious from across a room in the way they check their phone or won't sit still. You can't necessarily feel, accurately, how anxious you actually are while you're inside the feeling and trying to narrate it in real time. Here's the number worth sitting with. Across multiple large studies comparing self-ratings to reports from people who know you well, agreement between the two sits around 0.4 to 0.5 on a correlation scale where 1.0 would mean total agreement. Translated out of statistics, roughly half of what makes up your personality, according to the people who watch you actually live it, isn't something you're reporting back accurately about yourself. But here's where it gets interesting. Bring in a researcher named Simin Vazir, who has spent much of her career studying exactly this gap, and who built a framework in the mid-2000s called SOCA, the Self-Other Knowledge Asymmetry Model. Her argument, built on a stack of comparative studies pitting self-reports against reports from friends, partners, and even strangers observing short interactions on video, is that you and the people around you aren't both simply bad at reading you. You're each better at reading different halves of the same person. You have privileged access to your internal states, what you're feeling, what you intend, what runs through your head right before you act. Other people have privileged access to your behavior, what you actually, repeatedly do, across situations you're not tracking closely enough to notice the pattern in. because you're too busy living inside each individual moment to zoom out. You know your intentions. They know your habits. Neither of you gets the full picture alone, and neither version is more true than the other. They're just measuring different layers of the same structure. That single idea reframes the entire question. Self-knowledge was never supposed to be a solo project. It was always meant to be crowdsourced, pieced together from angles you literally cannot occupy at the same time. But here's where it gets interesting. Go back further, to a psychologist named Timothy Wilson, who spent years researching what he called the adaptive unconscious, the enormous share of mental processing that happens entirely below the level you can introspect on. In a well-known series of experiments he ran with Richard Nisbett starting in 1977, and in later work throughout the 1990s, Wilson found that people could confidently explain why they'd made a choice, which pair of stockings felt like the best quality, which poster they preferred for their dorm room, while the demonstrated actual cause of that choice, revealed by careful manipulation of the setup researchers hid in plain sight, had nothing to do with the explanation people gave out loud. Participants weren't lying. They were generating a plausible-sounding story after the fact and mistaking it, sincerely, for a memory of their real reasoning. One line worth isolating on its own. You don't get to watch yourself decide. You only get to watch yourself act, and then you write the explanation backward. That's not a small glitch tucked away in a lab result somewhere. That's most of what you'd call knowing who you are, a running narration composed after the decisions have already been made somewhere you don't have a window into, dressed up afterward to sound like foresight. But here's where it gets interesting. There's also the question of whether your personality even holds still long enough to be known in the first place. A psychologist named Walter Mischel spent the late 1960s challenging the entire field with what became known as the person-situation debate. After publishing research in 1968 showing that how consistent someone's behavior looks, say, how honest a child is, barely predicts how they'll behave in a different context 5 minutes later. A kid who won't cheat on a test might cheat at a game right afterward. Correlations between behavior in one situation and behavior in another, across dozens of studies Mischel reviewed, rarely climbed above roughly 0.3. That's a weak, almost coin flip level of consistency for something people describe, with total confidence as a fixed and stable trait. The honest version of you at work and the honest version of you at a family dinner might genuinely be different enough that averaging them into one tidy label, I'm an honest person, smooths over more than it actually reveals. But here's where it gets interesting. The most unsettling data point comes from outside psychology labs entirely. In 2015, a research team led by Michal Kosinski at the University of Cambridge published a study showing that an algorithm analyzing someone's Facebook likes could predict that person's personality more accurately than their own coworkers, using around 70 likes as input. Push the data to roughly 300 likes, and the algorithm outperformed the person's own spouse. Not a stranger glancing at a profile for 30 seconds. A spouse, the person who's supposedly closer to the real you than anyone alive, outpredicted by a system that had never spoken to you and only knew which pages you'd tapped a thumbs up on, years apart, without any sense of context behind a single one of them. Here's the part that makes all of this heavier than a fun psychology fact. There's a well-documented pattern researchers call the bias blind spot, studied extensively by Emily Pronin starting in the early 2000s. People are consistently better at spotting bias, blind spots, and self-serving distortion in other people's self-assessments than in their own. You can watch a friend clearly overestimate how funny they are, or underestimate how controlling they can be, and see it instantly, almost effortlessly. The mechanism that would let you see the same thing in yourself is, by its nature, the one part of the system you can't turn around to inspect, because it's the very tool doing the inspecting. Which means the gap between how you see yourself and how you're actually perceived isn't something you can simply try. Harder to close through introspection alone. Introspection is the tool that's malfunctioning in the first place. And no amount of staring harder at your own reflection fixes a mirror that's slightly warped. That's not a comforting conclusion, and it's not meant to be. It just means the confidence you feel when you describe yourself in 3 adjectives was never proof of accuracy. It was just proof that a story existed and felt finished. Which brings you back to that party survey. Thumb hovering, tapping your own name without a second of hesitation. Maybe the honest move was never answering for yourself at all. Maybe it's asking the person next to you what they'd have picked, because somewhere in that answer might be the piece of you that you've never once been able to see from in here.